Hello, chess friends, and welcome to the Thought of Chess channel, and welcome back to the Candidates Tournament in 2020-2021. We're back now in the round 12, and of course, a very important game has been also played between Wang Hao and Ian Nepomniachtchi. We have already covered the game between Anish Giri and Fabiano Caruana, in which Anish won the game with a great performance with the black pieces against Caruana. It means now for the tournament that Nepo has to win now this game against Wang Hao, also with the black pieces, in order to keep at least half of the point more than Anish Giri. But even if Nepo makes only a draw in this particular game, it means that Nepo is still in the lead because the tiebreaks are in Nepo's favor, because he won the match game bid against Anish Giri in the first round. So the additional criteria is the direct duel, so that's why the tiebreaks, as I said, are simply in Nepo's favor. So let's check out now the game. It was a very important now game in the tournament. You have to count now every half of the point. Every point, is important. If you lose some games, I think then it's simply over here for you. In this every other combination, I think Fabiano Caruana is out, so it's basically now a battle between Nepo and Anish Giri. So let's check out now the game between Wang Hao and Nepo. Wang Hao opened here with the move e4, e5, knight to f3, knight to f6. We have the Russian game. After knight takes e5, here we have d6, still the very often and popular line. After knight to e4, both players are taking the pawn in the center, and now here Wang Hao goes with the move d3, knight to f6, we have d4 and d5, and this is, I think, one of the most boring openings that I can see on the board. Also one of the most boring openings that I don't like is the exchange variation of the French defense. So the pawn structure is, first of all, what we should notice is symmetrical. So there are now 4 pawns on the queen side, 3 pawns on the king side. So basically what we're searching here for are some good outputs. The pawn structure is also static in the center, so it means from white perspective we're trying to occupy these 2 squares on the board, so e5 and the c5 square. From black's perspective, we are searching, of course, for some outposts on this square, on c4 and e4. In the continuation of the game, bishop to d3, played by Wang Hao. We have bishop to d6, also by Nepo, queen to e2. Now after queen to e7, we have really one of the most boring lines, I think, simply trading off the queens. The position gets more and more simplified, of course. This is not something maybe for the audience. It's not maybe the most popular line, but it's a pragmatic idea, I think, here for Nepo to play these lines, because he needs, as I said, only half of the point here still to be in the lead after this round. So Nepo has to now just play pragmatic chess. He doesn't have to anymore play chess for the fans. We have seen Nepo many times playing great attractive attacking brilliances. Now it's time simply to play for himself. After move castling, we have now knight to c6 and now c3, played by Wang Hao. If you try here bishop to g5, maybe to pin the knight, it seems like a dangerous idea, but actually it's not such a dangerous idea. I think knight to b4 can be played simply attacking the bishop, and now after knight to c3, we could fix our knight here, fix our pawn, pardon me, here with the move c6. Now you could try rook to e1, but we can hide, and maybe you could mess up a little bit the pawn structure, but it's, I think, a pleasant game here for black. The knights are out of the game. The knights don't have good scores on the board to occupy maybe the e5, as we said in the beginning, maybe the square c5. So now the bishop's activity, I think, is much better with the bishop pair. Black could have a pleasant game, but as I said, this is now, I think, a more and more simplified position in which I'm not sure who would win this. So after the move c3, we have now h6, knight to h4, attacking, of course, the weak square f5. We have rook to e8. Here Nepo is trying castling by hand, trying to get this castling position by moving now the rook simply to e8, and simply moving the king to f8. Knight to f5, the check, bishop to f5, bishop to f5, and we have now reached really a more and more simplified position in which Nepo simply secured the king on f8, g3, preventing some maybe some knight to h5, knight to f4 ideas also by Nepo. In the continuation of the game, knight to e7, here by Nepo attacking the bishop, bishop to h3. Maybe slightly better here is to play bishop to d3. Okay, you're staying on this diagonal. Here it's, of course, very important to maybe cut off the potential activity of the rook around the square c8, but staying with the bishop on d3 is, I think, we're controlling both sides of the board. You see now in the continuation of the game that after move bishop to h3, Wang Hao will have problems in order to develop the bishop somewhere else. The bishop is now okay, it has a good activity, but we always evaluate the strength of the bishop if it's really attacking something. And I think the main strategy to play against this bishop, because of course black doesn't have any more the bishop pair. Black is playing a knight versus bishop middle game. Black should simply get out of the range of the bishop, so it means now we should place our pieces where the bishop is not aiming. It's a simple rule in chess. Bishop to h3, nothing dramatically I think with the bishop, although it's not a crucial mistake. It's not something that you should resign because you play bishop to h3, but I still think bishop to d3 would be more flexible. You're controlling basically both sides of the board. I think it's slightly better. So as I said, you see now the problems of Wang Hao's bishop on h3. We have here knight to c8. Here Nepo is inviting basically Wang Hao to take. If you want to take, rook to c8 is on the board. And now, as we said in the beginning, in this static center setups, we're trying to occupy here the e4 square and also the c4 square. And now I think black is much better, because when we watch also the pawn structure a little bit, many pawns are on dark squares, so it means this bishop, the dark bishop of blacks, would be much more powerful in a potential endgame. So that's why trading off the bishop for a knight is not a good trade of pieces here for white. So here knight to d2, we have now a5. This move a5 paralyzes further the queen side. It means now what black is trying to do is to have the position compact. When we're playing knight versus bishop middle game, then you want to have a static pawn structure, really not so mobile pawn, so you're not allowing your opponent to create some dynamics. And then we're trying still our ideas of maybe knight to b6, knight to c4, or our potential outpost here on e4. So in the continuation of the game, we have a4, c6. Here by Nepo, fixing the pawn structure further, rook to d1, and now h5. Look at this structure here. It would be very risky, I think, when the queens would be on the board to play like this. But of course, after trades of pieces, it's not so important anymore. The king is not so endangered. As I said, this would be very risky if you push your pawns like this, if you allow your opponent spaces. But now after move h5, basically what Nepo is trying to do is to have really a static pawn structure, never allow maybe some pawn breakthroughs with the f3, g4, or maybe with some b4 ideas, because with the bishop pair, of course, white is trying to create dynamics. White is wants to open the position, wants to open files, open diagonals, and similar stuff. So here after move knight to f1, Nepo goes g6. You see Nepo doesn't have the light square bishop, so he plays with many pawns on light squares, because when you have given up your light square bishop or maybe a dark square bishop for a knight, then you want to protect that squares with your pawn. So that's why it's a pragmatic idea. So here comes the move f3, knight to b6. Nepo is targeting the c4 square, that's why b3. We have king to g7, and now king to f2, getting the king towards of course the center, trading off maybe the rooks on the e file, and maybe go into a slightly favorable endgame for white because of this bishop pair. So knight to d7, we have bishop to g5, knight to f8, and now rook to d1. We have knight to e6 here in this position. Nepo attacks the bishop, is again inviting maybe here Wang Hao to take. Bishop takes f6, then after king to f6, again white in this particular scenario wouldn't have the bishop pair, but I think this is still an equal game, opposite colored bishop. So if more pieces are traded off, for instance, if you trade off both of these rooks, if we trade off both of this knight, then of course with the opposite colored bishops, it would lead into a draw. But okay, here after move bishop to e3, here rook to c8, played by Nepo. We have bishop to d2 retreating. We have c5. Now finally Nepo wants to open the position, wants to activate this powerful bishop, because the king is really on a weird square here on f2. It's not a natural square for the king. So after move c5, we have now d takes c5, bishop to c5, and now king to g2. And this move basically forced now here Wang Hao to lock his bishop further. As we said in the beginning, okay, this bishop is maybe now active, but you see again now in the continuation that it doesn't have good activities. Rook to b1 was played, rook to c6, normal ideas. Of course, here Nepo is trying to simply attack the backward pawn on c3. This is now the clear target. It's a clear weakness in white position. In the continuation of the game, we have b4, knight to c7, and now rook takes e8 after trades of rooks. Here Wang Hao probably hopes for better position, because after b takes a5 we have bishop to a5 and he can take out now the pawn on b7, but it's not such a good position because again these are two weaknesses. Again, we have talked about this weakness on c3, also about this weakness on a4, and now Nepo simply activates back his knight to d6. After bishop rook takes a7, finally this idea bishop takes c3. Here Wang Hao tried the counterattack with the move bishop to d7, but now after knight to d7, bishop takes c3, rook takes c3, rook takes d7, we have now reached the endgame stage in which white has the distant pass pawn on the a file, black has this pawn, this very powerful pawn on the d file. And many times in this knight endgames you want to create a distant pass pawn, but I think the activity of white pieces is simply not good. The king can move towards the center, the king is slightly faster when it comes to central activity. In a potential endgame you have to play of course with your king, so the king will be much faster on the square e5 than white's king gets activated. On the other hand, the knight is more active, the knight is also very well centralized. The knight will hardly find a great way to come into the game. Even if you manage to develop it on d2, I'm not seeing good path. The knight cannot jump on c4, it cannot jump on e4, so the only strength that you have is this distant pass pawn. That's why here after move rook to c6, Wang Hao tried here the idea rook to e7. We'll try now to push the pawn, and now Nepo goes rook to c2, check, king to g1, and now simply pushing the pawn on d4. And this is now already a better position for black, because as we said, the centralization of the pieces is much better. The pieces are more towards the center. The king can also, as we said, come into the game, attack the rook, support this pawn. White king is simply too far away from the action. So here rook to d7, we have knight to f5. You see now how important it was to play the move h5 in the middle of the game. Now this knight cannot be kicked away with the potential g4. If you do that, then you get, of course, you get this knight to h4 ideas, and then you could lose also your rook on f3. So here in the continuation of the game a5, we have rook to a2. So you see, because of the activity, Nepo can play now all over the board. He can push the pawn, he can support his attack, he can attack this pawn, this isolated pawn on a5. So the activity again is simply better here for black. We have rook to a7. Here the engine suggests this wild line, suggests simply the move a6 to sacrifice the pawn after rook takes a6. Now finally to activate your knight on d2, and now after potential king to f6, maybe knight to e4, after king to e6, maybe you see knight to c5 is an opportunity to get the fork. So that's why here you would have to be careful, probably even to retreat with your king back to g7. And I think maybe in this particular scenario white could hang on to the draw. But in the continuation of the game, Wang Hao played rook to a7. He's trying, to simply push his pawn further, but now Nepo goes simply king to f6, activates this king. As we said, the king is much better in this endgame. We have a6 by Wang Hao, and now h4. This is a great move. Again, if you take, it's not simply good. Knight to h4, knight to f3 will happen. So that's why here rook to a8 was played. Now Nepo has the opportunity really to create a very nice and annoying pawn on h3. And with the support of this pawn, the problem is now this knight is in this diagonal setup against this pawn, so you need, I think, at least 3-4 tempi in order to somehow attack this pawn. I'm not thinking of a good way how you should attack it, so that's why it's much better position. Now there are even some threats of knight to rook to g2, and somehow getting the rook knight here to e2, maybe even threatening some checkmates with the support of the knight. So so far Nepo is trying to build really a nice mating net after, around the king. After move h3, we have a7. Now Nepo goes king to e7, we have g4, but now knight to d6. If you try, for instance, knight to h4 here, then you could risk this idea. Knight to d2 is very risky, because actually you cannot take the knight. Then you get something like, pardon me, here rook to e8, first to check, and pardon me, here rook to e8, and then you have to take it. Then we can promote here the queen. So black has also some trouble. Black can never leave the defense of the a file, but here Nepo found a great maneuver, knight to d6. He's trying now to play rook to g2 and activate this knights further, maybe even something like knight to e3. Here in the continuation of the game, we have rook to b8. Now Nepo simply takes, and now rook to b4, but now d3. You see, this pawn is very hard to take, but here Wang Hao found a great way how to get his pawn back, and now in the continuation, knight to c4 was played, knight to g3, and now comes this idea rook to g2. This pawn is very, very important. This pawn supports simply the rook. Now the knight is coming into the game. In the continuation of the game, king to h1 was played, king to f8, and now rook to c3. This move wasn't really the best of moves. Here you have to play rook to d8. The problem is now if you try king to g7, then we can again get back with a rook to f2 maybe, and now king to g1, maybe rook to g2, again king to h1. If you try maybe to activate your king here, then you get simply knight to e4. So I think in this particular scenario, maybe black could defend this position after something like king to e5. Then you risk also this ideas, knight to g5 followed with knight takes h3. So it's also a nice defensive strategy how to grab this pawn. If you grab this pawn, then this would be probably potential drawish endgame. If you try, for instance, f6, then it's not good. Then you get f4. f4 is winning the game immediately, because if you take king takes f4, then you get simply knight takes h3 and you lose the rook. So it's something that maybe Wang Hao missed after the move rook to c3. It gives now here Nepo great opportunities to activate the knight, because now the serious threat is knight to d2 followed with knight to f1 and threatening even a checkmate here. So that's why rook to c8, again the check, king to g7, and now after the move rook to d8 we have rook to f2 here by Nepo, and Nepo has now the opportunity to grab this pawn. In the continuation, king to g1, rook takes f3, knight to e4, and now after rook to e3, knight to g3 again played, but now rook to a3, and in this position, believe me or not, Wang Hao resigned. So I'm not sure why Wang Hao resigned. Maybe this is playable. This is a +2 position for black, but I still think Wang Hao should have struggled the battle here somehow for a draw. I think let's see the best continuation, the best engine continuation here. The engine suggests for white to move g5, after move knight to d3, then king to f1, knight to c5, and now maybe fixing the knight here on e6, trying to protect our pawn on g5, and now after something like knight to e2, maybe rook to a4, and going also after this pawn by playing rook to g4 followed with rook to g2. But still, I kind of think in this, it's not of course a top engine game, it's human level. If you manage somehow maybe to grab this pawn on h3, then you could also maybe sacrifice the knight for 2 pawns. So it's a +2 position, as I said, for black. I think Wang Hao should have battled here somehow for the draw. As we said, after the move rook to a3, in this position Wang Hao resigned. In my opinion, you have to battle. Also, it's not that I'm favoring anything, but a draw here, a potential draw, would mean really, really many things now for Anish Giri, because now with the win, still Nepo has a half of a point more than Anish Giri, but has also this tiebreaks advantages, as we said, as Nepo won the game against Anish Giri in the first round. So, in my opinion, Wang Hao should have battled here. I'm not sure why he resigned. But okay, still it's a better game for Nepo. Nepo played here an outstanding game. If you put his PGN into a chess engine, it will show you that here Nepo played almost a perfect top engine game in such a static and not so interesting, I think, opening line. But still, I think this is something that you should play further and try maybe to get at least a draw. So okay, I hope that you enjoyed this game. I didn't enjoy it so much. It was a tough battle here for Nepo, but it was a pragmatic idea to play like this, because you have to win now this tournament. No one will tell you you played great chess, but you finished on the 2nd place. No, you have to simply win this tournament. No one will remember what really was going on. Only the winner will be remembered. So that's why I think it was a good choice by Nepo to play like this, and now he's really the top favorite to win this very important tournament. So okay, I hope that you enjoyed the game. Meanwhile, you can watch my other commented chess games by this tournament. Here are some games that I've analyzed before, and if you want to see maybe the best chess games of all times, check out my best chess games of all time series. Here's also the link, and if you like this content, don't forget to subscribe to my channel. See you soon with some more videos, and chess is the best, of course.